Well, good morning and welcome to this Infrastructure Victoria webinar on reimagining the city. How can Melbourne get its buzz back? I'm Jonathan Spear, Chief Executive Officer of Infrastructure Victoria, and so glad that you can all be joining us this morning. I, of course, would like to start this discussion by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people. I'm coming to you from Naarm, also known as Melbourne, and I would very much like to acknowledge the traditional owners, but also any other Aboriginal elders and people who might be joining this event today. Now, many of you are probably familiar with Infrastructure Victoria. We are Victoria's independent infrastructure advisor, and we produce a 30-year infrastructure strategy. We give independent advice to government and undertake research to help progress policy and infrastructure prioritisation. And you will have heard from us in previous webinars that we've had, and you can find a lot of work on our website. What we would like to do today, of course, is broaden the conversation to the views of other leaders of Melbourne and hear from them about how we can bring Melbourne's buzz back. And so I'm really pleased to introduce those panellists who are joining us today. We have the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Sally Capp, Paul Zahra, CEO of the Australian Retailers Association, and Felicia Mariani, who's the CEO of the Victorian Tourism Industry Council. And you, of course, will have an opportunity to pose your questions to the panellists, and you'll see that below in the Slido element of the screen that you're viewing. So please, as we're talking, feel free to put your views in and questions into the chat there in the Q&A, and we'll endeavour to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. So let me set the scene a bit. We are at a point where we are starting to emerge from the COVID pandemic, but of course it's an uneven emergence. I'm back in the office today, and many other offices workers are, but of course many are working from home as well, at least part of the week. If you're working in the medical field, if you're working in schools, if you're working in hospitality or retail, the effects of the pandemic are lingering on. But of course, we've also had a lot of changes, and some of them have been positive and some very challenging. And that's what we want to explore today. How can we get Melbourne's buzz back and make sure we keep it? How can we look at both the centre of the city and broader metropolitan Melbourne? And of course, what is the important role that infrastructure might play to underpin that? So we're going to start by perhaps talking about the state of play with infrastructure and the state of the play in the city. So what I'd like to do is put to the panel members, and perhaps starting with Sally, how is the city's infrastructure faring in this current environment? And what can be the role of infrastructure in supporting the recovery of Melbourne and its ongoing thriving?
Wow, what an enormous question to ask with, but very important, Jonathan. It's lovely to be here with you. I'm beaming in from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people and delighted to join the panel this morning and the discussion. Very important, as I said. Well, we have just gone through 2 years of the biggest disruption in our lifetimes, and there's very much the sense of how we needed to respond to the crisis and the revitalisation of the city now. But the element of continuing to look forward and ensuring that the investments and decisions that we're making have that future state in mind. This is important from our perspective because whilst we've been the city with the most days in lockdown and we've really probably taken the biggest economic hit of any municipality in Australia, we are still forecast to have significant growth, particularly over the next decade as we become the most populous city in Australia, Greater Melbourne, and our gross local product moves from 104 billion pre-COVID to 150 billion by 2031. So those plans for the future are critical. And just to touch on a few key points as we get this conversation started, Firstly, you mentioned green open spaces and the importance of parks. We saw the use of those spaces increase dramatically during COVID because that was the only place people could go, really. And we've seen that demand for green open spaces continue. So we're actually increasing our budget around maintenance of our parks and gardens, but also expanding and increasing the amount of open spaces that we have in the city. And this is important for leisure and recreation. It's important for our events sector, and it's also top of the pops in terms of tourism and attractions. So many factors important there. We, of course, have been absolutely obsessed by transport for lots of reasons, and I'm sure we'll come to bike lanes in detail as part of this conversation. But to give you some highlights, car use is back at 94% of pre-pandemic levels. Public transport has been stubbornly stuck in that sort of 60 to 65%, and we really need to give it the biggest shove because we really rely on our public transport network to be utilised fully to know that we can really drive that growth and activity into the future. And so we're really interested in discussion on how we can get more people back onto public transport, and really our events schedule to move COVID caution to COVID confidence. A big part of that has been getting people back onto public transport and breaking COVID habits. I'd also say that we know that our fastest growing cohort of transport users is what we call active transport bikes, but also e-scooters have been incredibly well embraced by people in Melbourne, demand amongst the highest in the world. And so we're looking at ways that we can accommodate that more active transport. And that is key because everybody that comes into the city drives economic value for the city. And it's important that we're able to welcome everybody safely into the city and to move them around the city as well. And look, just to touch on one more theme before I hand over to Felicia and Paul, we do understand that we need to be creative in the way that we use existing spaces, particularly the rhythm of the city, as we all say, has changed dramatically. And from our perspective, we've been looking at different ways that we can vitalise empty retail shop fronts. We've been looking at ways that we can host events outdoors in different ways. And we're also understanding that we're not going to see 100% of the people that came in for work pre-COVID here post-COVID 100% of the time. But reusing those office spaces for new entrants to the market. We were basically full pre-COVID, and we've got really good hustle and bustle by the SMEs looking for deals to come back into what is the biggest economic market in Victoria back here in the city. And we're also looking at ways that spaces can be used in completely different ways, whether it's from arts and culture through to collaboration and creative spaces. These are the sorts of conversations that it's important for us to have as we transform and reset Melbourne for the future.
Well, that's a great start. Thank you, Sally, and quite a list too. And your emphasis on getting people back on public transport, of course, is something that Infrastructure Victoria, we've been very strong on as well. And in fact, published a report about transporting Melbourne's recovery, which really point to the importance of that, and also the opportunities that lie with introduction of things like off-peak fares, which will help people travel outside of those peak periods and after hours, as well as one of the ways of getting people back on public transport. I might go to you now, Paul. So what's your take on how's Melbourne's infrastructure faring, both in the CBD but also in broader Melbourne, and what's that? How's that gelling with what the retail industry needs?
Well, look, first up, I'll just start with retail trade, because that's always a good place to start. So we had a record month through April and May as an industry. We're setting new records in the retail industry. So that's interesting. The last ABS data was 33.9 billion. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that it is an uneven economy and recovery, rather. And what we're seeing is CBD particularly is really, really suffering. Now, Melbourne won the unwanted award of being the most locked down city, not only in the country, but in the world. So it's a hard brand now to fix. But I know we've been working very closely with Sally and the team to try and actually look at innovative ways to get people back. The big issue, of course, is the fact that we haven't seen the return of the office worker. So the occupancy rate in Melbourne CBD is still, whilst it's climbing back, it's only at 48%. So more than half of the office workers are actually deciding to work from home. Now, in my personal opinion, I don't think we're going to, we'll see that claw back, of course, but it's going to be a challenge, because what we did see through COVID was this escalation or acceleration of trends that were already occurring. Now, in the retail world, there was this massive sort of trajectory towards online shopping, but we would have expected that, given that the city was in lockdown. But what we didn't expect was this trend around people wanting to work from home. So of course, what this has meant that people have discovered they can save this time, quite a bit of time, by working from home. So that's a real challenge that I'm hoping we get to discuss today, because with a low unemployment rate, that's a hard one to fix. And there are certainly ways of trying to entice people back. Pre-pandemic weekends are sort of back to pre-pandemic levels, which is great, but it's that Monday to Friday, Mondays and Fridays being the worst level of traffic that we're seeing currently reported by retailers. So, you know, there's opportunity, but there is a new rhythm, and that's something that Sally, the Lord Mayor, just said, which I think is a really important point. We need to understand that rhythm and leverage that significantly. The 24-hour economy needs to be rethought. We need to be able to move from day to night with ease. Currently, retailers trade broadly between 9 and 5:30, and then the restaurants kick in at 7 o'clock. So there's this gap that occurs, and we need to look at international cities to get inspiration.
Thanks, Paul. And speaking of international, of course, you know, much of what Felicia works with is both international and domestic tourism, of course. So, Felicia, how is Melbourne faring in tourism? And what is the role of infrastructure in, you know, driving people back to our great city?
Thanks, Jonathan. And yeah, look, it has been, we've all talked about the kind of two-speed recovery, and certainly recovery from a tourism point of view has been a very different story from regional versus metro. And, you know, historically, it's been quite interesting because the strength and the powerhouse has always been Melbourne. And it's always been well ahead of the performance of our regional areas in Victoria. But COVID has really flipped that. What we've seen now is, in fact, that our regional areas are actually performing better than they were pre-pandemic. Their visitation, their spend is well ahead of 2019 figures. Melbourne is starting to come back, and obviously our event calendar has really been a huge impetus in growing that visitation back into our city. But just to illustrate, I think, the challenge of not just Melbourne, but capital cities. Both Melbourne and Sydney have struggled in this regard because of our reliance on international. Prior to the pandemic, Melbourne actually had 40% of its visitor spend coming from international visitors and 32% coming from interstate. So nearly 3/4 of the visitor spend that really allowed Melbourne to prosper actually came from people living outside of our state. So it's not hard to see, when the borders shut, when, you know, everything was closed off around the world, the capital cities were obviously going to get hurt much more deeply than what was going to happen in our regional centres, and particularly with all the intrastate travel, because no one could get out of their own state. Hence, we saw this terrific performance in the rest of Victoria, not so much in our capital city. Now, that is starting to change. And one of the really positive things that we're seeing is that the growth and rate of recovery is really speeding up. And from everything we heard, we just did a conference for 2 days here in Melbourne with about 600 industry folk and some really great lineup of presenters. But what the projections are is that while recovery will start to happen in 2022, 2023 is actually going to see really rapid growth, and particularly back to our international visitation and spend figures. The biggest challenge for Melbourne, of course, is that we were so heavily reliant on China. And we know that China is going to be a slow market to recover, aside from the geopolitical issues, just because they've decided to, you know, chase a kind of zero strategy when it comes to COVID. So real challenges from that perspective, because it was such an important market for us. But the bottom line is, we are on a really strong trajectory for recovery. So having conversations right now about the infrastructure that's needed to really kind of put that on steroids is actually very important for us. And one of the key things that's going to help us is the connectivity, the transport around our city, the transport around our whole state. And, you know, let's not forget that we've got something on the horizon in less than 4 years' time. We keep talking about the comm games in 4 years, but we don't have 4 years. So we've got a lot of preparation that we need to get ready for right now to actually set us in a position to leverage all of the tourism opportunities, the visitor economy opportunities that will come out of hosting that big event as well. So really timely discussion for us to be looking at what's needed to make sure that Melbourne doesn't just get back to what it was before, but really becomes a new and vibrant city in the face of all the changes that both of my colleagues have spoken about already.
Yeah, thanks, Felicia. You know, there's absolutely a big opportunity for us to grasp here. A reminder to our audience that if you've got any questions you'd like to pose to the panel, you can put those in the Slido box beneath the screen that you're looking at the moment. Paul and Sally, you both talked about the changing patterns of work, both in terms of days and also flexibility in terms of the times that people can work. And so I've got a sense, Paul, from you especially, you've got some burning ideas about how we can make the most of this. So I might go to you and then Sally around, you know, what do you think the ways are that we can make take the best out of these changes in people's working habits? Both, of course, for the workplace, but also for the thriving economy of both inner Melbourne, but also maybe more broadly across Melbourne.
Sure. So look, the biggest thing I think is greater coordination amongst all the different industries to come together to have a coordinated effort. But to get a 24-hour economy requires some strategic thinking. And if you think about the US and even the UK, most of the retailers and most of the city doesn't wake up till at least 10 a.m., possibly 11 in some cases. And they move into the nighttime economy with ease. So that means that the shopper that comes in to shop in the city actually then is able to go from a shopping experience to dinner, to a club, to a bar afterwards. And that has to happen seamlessly. So there's a bit of still some significant collaboration to have, but it has to be rethought because Monday to Friday, of course, has got a different set of dynamics and a different rhythm that's required. Equally, there's big benefits because what that would mean is that you've got retail and hospitality workers not fighting to get into the city at the same time as office workers are. So there's a massive rethink around how the city operates. And that's the biggest thinking. There are also some data points from COVID. So what we didn't realise is that during COVID, about 2 million Australians actually went and got a pet. Now, they're tied to those pets now. They're actually at home looking after a dog or a cat or whatever pet they've just chosen to do. But we have to become much more of a pet-friendly city. And that means public transport and also offices need to consider that if they want to get office workers back. And that requires, again, rethinking. So there's a series of strategies that need to be rethought. The retail calendar has to go on steroids. So it means having activations, and I know the Lord Mayor has been very proactive in encouraging that within Melbourne, but it needs to be obviously amplified in such a way that there's a reason to come in. If I use an example, Vivid in Sydney has actually brought in, you know, hundreds of thousands of people into the CBD, and the retailers and the hospitality industry have really leveraged that significantly. So there's those three things: a coordination around what does that 24-hour economy look like. There's certainly a retail calendar needs to be working a little harder to get people in. Public transport becomes really, really key because, of course, it's getting workers in and out, but also shoppers and people that are being entertained. We can't rely or wait for tourists to come back quickly or for workers to come back alone. It needs a significant intervention. And these things will take time, hard to implement during winter, but definitely an opportunity for summer for sure.
Yeah, and Paul, what you're saying is very much attuned to what we've said to Infrastructure Victoria about the opportunities to coordinate, you know, employers and employees, as well as to use the best use of infrastructure. I think I also heard from you a call for return of Bring Your Dog to Work Day. That came through pretty clearly as well, and I think you'll earn yourself a lot of fans for that. Sally, what's your perspective on this in terms of how we can make the best of the changes to these working patterns?
Yeah, I think that theme of working together is absolutely critical. And for all the dog lovers out there, please know we've just increased the number of off-leash dog parks in the city so that you've got plenty of space during breaks for your puppies. But look, really importantly, just wanted to touch on a few things, Jonathan, riffing off Paul. Interestingly, for our nighttime economy advisory committee made up of industry experts, their focus at the moment is on the twilight. It is on that time where traditionally people were leaving work and before the city really takes off. How do we fill those spaces? And we see it during times like Comedy Festival when there are those after work shows, the 5 o'clock shows, and how critical they are for keeping people around. But they do need to be supported by hospitality and retail offers so the entire city is vibrant. And as an example, we had Art After Dark at the start of June, where we saw foot traffic in the city up 172% on the Saturday, and that was very much supported by retail staying open later, as well as some of our big institutions like the NGV and State Library being open all night. So this sort of coordination is absolutely key, and we do appreciate the role that Infrastructure Victoria plays, the leadership role in that as well. I just wanted to touch on something else that's critical as we go forward, and that is just people. Despite the fact that we're talking about we need more people because of what is remote working and flexible working now, we just need more people. One of the critical issues for hospitality, retail and entertainment is being able to access more labour. And that's certainly true across professional sectors as well. So that call out for welcoming more immigrants, more international students is another area where I think we can have a coordinated effort and voice, and certainly a priority for us in our engagement with the new federal government. In terms of work in particular, we're really keen to rush towards that new rhythm. I was trying to think of a quick dance, a quick step towards that new rhythm as quickly as possible, because it's the uncertainty whilst we're still in this state of transition that is the most tumultuous and still creates a lot of economic hardship for our small businesses around town, that lack of consistency and certainty. Some hospitality businesses are short of food on some days and they're throwing food out on others. Wednesdays and Thursdays are now our busiest days in the city, up at the 80% of foot traffic, and Mondays are our quietest, still sometimes as low as 25 to 30% of pre-COVID foot traffic, but it's really difficult still to know. And for us, it's about earning the commute and working with major employers to understand what can we do to earn the commute. We want people to want to come back. And we know that workplaces are far more nuanced and that people are coming with purpose, because if they don't need to be in the city, then they're fully enabled to work from home or work from remote places. And so really coming with purpose and earning the commute is important. We've seen all sorts of things, from free coffee vouchers, which we do here at Town Hall, to employers looking at new premises and really moving into premium so they can offer the latest and the best of working environments and create that sense of excitement, bringing pets to work, bringing your parents to work. Whatever it might be, we've had our FOMO Fridays, we've had FOMO offers, which we did with retailers, that sense of missing out. But for us, it really is about continuing to promote the benefits of working in a city environment, that agglomeration effect, as Richard Florida calls it. We're still the biggest employment market in Victoria, the biggest talent pool in Victoria, the biggest customer pool in Victoria, and really that sense of opportunity exists here in the city. So where people are looking for that on scale, this is the place to be, and it's important that we continue to promote that with our major employers. And then the last thing I was going to say is that we really are going back to the benefits of a 20-minute suburb. Melbourne was the original 20-minute suburb in the early 90s. We reorganised ourselves to become that city, and the priority on living in the city remains as a major part of our transformation going forward. We're expecting almost 100,000 extra residents over the next 10 years. And that takes a lot of work as well, but just reinforcing the benefits of living near where you work, as well as being on the doorstep of the best entertainment, recreation and leisure precinct. And bringing those worlds together is another important aspect of bringing vibrancy to our city economy.
Yeah, and so it's really interesting you highlight there the sort of agglomeration effect to the city on the ongoing attraction of the city. And of course, Infrastructure Victoria has done modelling around what some of the sort of medium-term effects might be of working from home. And the audience can find that in our report called The Post-Pandemic Commute, which is on our website. And of course, what that shows is even with working from home, the central city of Melbourne is likely to remain quite an attractive place for employers to locate in the future, in part because of the great transport links and also the agglomeration effects of people being together. We've had some great questions coming through from our audience so far, so it's probably a good time to throw some of those in, and I'll combine them a bit. And it's related to the issue of getting people back into the city. So some of the questions that have raised have pointed out that there's been some lobbyists and commentators who've said, basically, we should be trying to get everybody back into the city the way it was before. We need to get office workers back 5 days a week so that they can be buying coffee and lunches and going down to Bourke Street Mall and buying something at lunchtime. And I guess the question that has been put by the audience member is, well, is that really realistic? And, no one stepped in when Blockbuster was going broke because Netflix had a better model. Should we just accept that this is a form of economic transformation that might be painful in the short run, but has, a greater economic good in the longer run? And maybe it's not as simple as that, but be really interested to hear the panel's views on that. And also another related question, which is, should we be relying upon relatively small purchases by office workers in the city to revitalise the city's economy, or is the entertainment and dining experiences and other forms of economic and social engagement a more sustainable way to rebuild the city? Really be interested. Paul, would you like to start on that? And I'm sure Felicia, you'd have a view on that as well.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan.
Look, I think this is the way I would look at this. I'm looking at this. I think you can incentivise and cajole and request, but it's an employee's market right now. And I think employees will vote with their feet if you force them back in the office. So there's been a lot of pressure on us as an industry association is to drive employees back in through the employment network. But, in a low unemployment rate, all you're going to do is lose people. So my view is that we have to reinvent and it needs the city, and that is the 24-hour economy. It's the twilight that the Lord Mayor spoke about. It's the evenings, it comes back to redefining those core trading hours, because that's really, really important. So, the 10 a.m. start with a later finish, introducing potentially Saturday night shopping. The weekends are going very, very strongly. So how do we leverage those in a coordinated fashion? So whilst I think it can excite and entice people back, I don't think it can instruct. You'll just ultimately lose people, and that's not great for business.
Felicia, what's your take on this?
Yeah, Paul, can I just say, for someone who grew up in an environment where I was able to shop every Saturday till 10 o'clock at night, I have never, ever gotten used to not being able to shop in the nighttime here in Australia. So if you can get that one over the line, I'll be really pleased. Can I just say one of the things, a bit to the point, Jonathan, about someone's comment that should we just accept that, we're not going to change the world by getting people to buy coffees in the afternoon, and let's just recognise that, we're kind of moving more to an evening and nighttime love affair with the city. Let us remember here that from a visitor's point of view, it does not work. You can't have people who are coming from other states and other countries who are in our city, staying in our hotels, activating, and they can't find a place to get coffee. They can't find a place to have breakfast in the morning. And I've heard this already from people who are struggling in the city to find places outside of the hotel to have breakfast in the morning. There's a lot of places, particularly on those Mondays and Fridays, as you said, Paul, they're not opening as early because there just aren't the workers in the city. if we want to go back to being a global city, if we want to go back to being recognized as an absolute place that you must visit as an overseas visitor or interstate visitor, our event calendar is driving people from all around the world back to Melbourne. We have to be able to cater for that. So we can't just assume that it's just buying those coffees that's going to change the world. This is about us regaining our reputation as a global city. The other point I wanted to make, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, the work from home phenomenon is shifting to a work from anywhere phenomenon. And there are companies now around the world who are giving their people time to go work from anywhere. So you can combine the holiday and the work environment, and we can encourage people to come into the city from other parts of Australia and indeed other parts of the world, come and work from home from Melbourne. So there's huge opportunities for that, and some of our operators are already doing this. They're already being creative and really getting on that bandwagon of encouraging people. Work from home does not just mean from home. You can do that from anywhere. So how do you combine your love affair with the city, your love affair with events and activities that you want to do, with finding time to also work? And employers are becoming a lot more flexible in that regard and giving their employees the opportunity to do that. So we need to lead that trend here in Melbourne and in Victoria. We really need to get on the front foot of what is emerging as a byproduct of this working from home philosophy.
Yeah, that's right, Felicia. And we're seeing that, of course, in a lot of organisations, and it's becoming a competitive advantage to attract good people. And at Infrastructure Victoria, we take what we call a moments that matter approach. So what are those moments that matter for you to be in the office and collaborating and taking advantage of being in the city? And what are those moments where being somewhere else, be it at home or elsewhere, is the best way for you to be doing your job? So it's something many people have been rethinking. Of course, cities around the world have been rethinking their urban planning as well. And throughout COVID, we've seen this in London, New York, Paris, many cities that we look to where they've been taking different approaches during COVID. In particular, having more cycling lanes, becoming more walking friendly, reducing congestion. And of course, we've seen some of that in Melbourne. And if you haven't been paying attention, there's been quite a bit of discussion about the changes, particularly around bike lanes in inner Melbourne. And Sally and I have certainly participated in some of those public discussions. So let's talk about maybe not like we create an elephant in the room of cycling lanes. And Sally, where are we at with cycling in Melbourne? What's the state of play? And where might we be headed in the future with all forms of accessibility to Melbourne?
Thanks, Jonathan. It is a very topical question, and I think everybody understands that global cities and global transport networks need to be able to find space for everyone to travel safely, whatever mode of travel that is. And certainly we've been inspired by other cities like London, Milan and New York, who have hundreds of kilometres of bicycle tracks coming into and around their cities. Of course, it is so difficult when you've got a busy transport network to try to find space, dedicated space for a mode, and getting that balance right is something we're really working through at the moment. But we do know that when we introduce protected bicycle lanes, that the usage of bikes on those laneways goes up exponentially. And it really is a very important way of supporting and growing active transport in cities, which has benefits for the individual. It has benefits for actually reducing congestion on our roads because it's fewer car trips, and it also has environmental and long-term sustainability benefits. So we're really dedicated to bicycle lanes, and it's about getting that balance right. Just a couple of stats to let people know where we're at. Currently, bicycle lanes take up about 1% of our total transport network space. And for car drivers and commercial vehicle drivers, we understand that it's important we can continue to welcome vehicles into our city. Vehicles currently, or pre-COVID, I should say, made up 40% of trips done into the city, and cars and vans have about 60% of the available transport network space on and around the CBD. So those elements hopefully help people identify that whilst bicycle lanes seem new and they've taken up a lot of the transport debate recently, they represent still a very small proportion of our physical space and they're currently about 5% of total trips done into the city. Interestingly, e-scooters is really driving a lot of the current interest, because the e-scooter share scheme has taken off in such an enormous way. It's just a trial at the moment, but some of the stats is that for every 10 requests for a vehicle, only one is available at the moment. So we know that demand really outstrips supply. From our perspective, 74% of the trips done are for some sort of economic purpose, and 45% of the trips done replaced a trip done by a car, which we know then helps ease congestion on our roads. So for all of those reasons, active transport, whether it's bicycles, e-scooters, and the myriad of other things that people are starting to use, absolutely vital for our city. Will they be the majority of trips done into the city? No, that is still public transport, and we're really focused on supporting public transport. We've got a richness of public transport and we want it to remain that way. But just so people know, around the city, 84% of trips done around our CBD are done by foot. So another area of focus for us is pavements. And whilst the bicycle debate has taken up a lot of oxygen recently, it's the myriad of transport needs that we are trying to balance and invest in together with state government to ensure that we can continue to service everybody who wants to come into our city. It's residents, it's workers, it's students, it's visitors. And we have to find a way to balance all of these things as we go forward. And we think that we're getting it pretty right so far.
Great, thanks, Sally. Paul, I'd really be interested in your perspective on this. Much of the commentary has been around the relationship between parking of private vehicles, either on street or off street, and the economic health of retailers, but also challenges that delivery drivers might have. And I'd be interested in your perspective on that, both in inner Melbourne, but also, are there any differences to this when we look more broadly across Melbourne and retail in some of Melbourne's middle and outer suburbs?
Well, the stats are telling us that people are avoiding public transport. So there's definitely an issue there around people feeling safe. And that needs to be resolved somewhat, some way. We've got to give people greater confidence to use public transport system. Now, the public transport system in Melbourne is actually outstanding, and we're in a position, I guess, where people are avoiding it because we know that people are choosing to drive into the city to avoid being in a high volume area. So I don't think discounting public transport is actually really the issue here. I just think it's a safety concern and cautious aspect post-COVID that may need some type of advertising program to actually educate people. The CBD is still vital from a retail point of view. So whilst people are shopping locally and the numbers are great, the majority of retailers have their flagship locations in the CBD. If you think department stores or luxury stores or any branded merchandise, they're actually located in the CBD. So we're really keen to solve this specific issue around getting people back onto public transport. And part of that, it may not be so much an issue in Melbourne around actually how do you allow people to shop as they were previously through COVID. I use the pet example. It's just one example because, if people aren't able to with ease travel with their dog and they can do that locally, that will make a big difference about how they get in and out of a particular locality. So that's an important aspect around the way people think. Equally, from a public transport point of view, as I mentioned, trading hours before and that coordinated effect, the whole the whole public transport timetable needs a review because people are clearly commuting differently to make sure that during those peak times, people can get in and out with access and with ease. So it's a full review and a full collaboration, I would say.
Thanks, Paul. And of course, one of the things I always find most charming about going to places like Tokyo or Paris is that you're always interacting with the residents' pets when you're shopping and dining and travelling around. So, Felicia, be interested in your perspective on a couple of things. Firstly, Sally's been particularly talking about the importance of active transport, especially walking in a Melbourne. And so, your perspective on how important that is for visitors to Melbourne would be great. And the other piece, which would be good to start to talk to, is the role of urban design. And again, when we go to cities around the world that we love to visit, often it's the urban design of those places that make it such a great visitor experience. What's your perspective on that? And is there anything more we can be doing both around how people get around Melbourne, but also the design opportunities we have?
Yeah, I think there's an enormous opportunity right now for us to really rethink how we want our locals and our visitors to engage with our city. And let's remember, in terms of attracting people to our city, people end up living where they love to visit. So getting people to come and experience our city and fall in love with our city as a visitor is the best way to actually get them to think about living in Melbourne and living in Victoria. And we've seen that happen over 20 years. It's been a huge driver for us in encouraging people to come here because they love the vibrancy of the city. And walking around our city is one of the best ways to fall in love. And when I talk about city, I do want to be careful here because I do refer to the broader Greater Melbourne. Everyone traditionally, the concentration of our accommodation is obviously in the CBD footprint, but it is the magic and the fabric and the depth of our experiences in and around Melbourne as well, in that sort of Greater Melbourne area. So walking capability and connectivity to some of these other experiences becomes really, really important. And I know I talk about visitors, but the reality is visitors and locals want to kind of do the same thing. They actually do want to, find new and unique ways to connect with secret parts of the city that they hadn't discovered yet. And we saw through COVID that, being a visitor in your own backyard has enormous appeal. And we all had so much to learn about our city and our state. But I think, this ability to navigate easily through our city, and we haven't mentioned yet, Sally, your Green Line project, but, that is such a massive, will be a massive big boost if we can get this thing over the line, I love New York. Sorry, I've got so many friends and family that live there. And that is kind of the poster child for how they have reinvented how you engage with that city. And, their project there now, their similar project is absolutely on everybody's bucket list and must do when they get into the city. We can have that same thing here, and we can find new ways of connecting our visitors with all of the intricate parts of our city that can be really complex to access if you don't know where you're going. And then let's bring on to that our connectivity. And Paul, you're absolutely right. Some of the best public transport, I think we have a great public transport network here in Victoria. And we are really the first to criticize our public transport. But again, coming from a world where the best I could do was a bus, and it wasn't very good in where I grew up. And that's a pretty consistent thing all across America and many other countries around the world. We have a very complex and intricate public transport system. And yes, it has its failures and it has its difficulties, but it's pretty darn good. And a lot of the times when we compare ourselves to Singapore or to Japan, they don't always have the same breadth of network that we have. And Singapore is a classic example. Yes, they run a terrific system, but they don't nearly cover the span of territory that we do in our system. So this education piece of our public transport network, showing how easy it is to connect to these amazing parts of our city that maybe are just a little bit too far out to the other side of where you might live, but doing it by public transport can be a lot of fun. Can I also say, and back to this point of getting everyone to work together in this whole Team Victoria that we've been talking about at our conference for the last 2 days, how do we start our event experience with the commencement of your journey? Events don't start just when you walk into the gate of that event. The whole excitement of that event starts from the moment that you leave your house. And I think transport has a huge opportunity to become a much bigger part of the vibrancy of our event calendar. You liking that, Sally?
I am.
I agree.
I just think there's an enormous opportunity for us to re-engender our public transport system with our public, because they can become such an integral part of our event calendar. So anyway, I'll turn over to you, Sally, because I'm sure you probably got things to say in that regard.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, a very strong call there, Felicia, to make the best use of the infrastructure we've got already. Yeah. And so maybe as we turn to Sally, I might inject a couple of the good questions we've been having coming through that are related to urban design. So Sally, you mentioned earlier about having more people living in Melbourne in now and in the future. And so some of the questions that have been coming through have been around what are the great ways in which we can have greater diversity of housing choice and more affordable housing in inner Melbourne. And I think the other piece of urban design is that let's face it, it's contested. So the quality of urban design and how much is new buildings and high-rises versus reusing or adapting historical buildings or precincts that we've got. And I know the City of Melbourne has been doing some thinking about that. So your views on those, plus I'm sure you're going to mention Green Line, would be great to hear. Thanks, Sally.
Good. Well, look, let me start with housing and keep pressuring all of us. I'm so thrilled actually that this is a moment in time, because with state government with the big build at $5.3 billion to be invested, the new federal government coming in with a $10 billion commitment to social and affordable housing, and local governments doing everything they can, understanding that diversity of our population really drives success of cities, this is the moment for us to deliver more on what those ambitions have been. Quality, diversity of options, diversity of pricing, and the way we're designed, which you picked up on, Jonathan, all of those things, absolutely critical. Let me just highlight a few things. Firstly, we are lucky in Melbourne to have two really big urban renewal precincts, Fisherman's Bend expecting 80,000 new residents and Arden expecting 30,000 new residents, in addition to what we're seeing happening around more established parts of the city. It's important for us that planning is done well, and of course we're working closely with the state government on what we can deliver there, and a focus on how do we include, ensure, mandate more affordable and key worker housing is really central to those discussions, and being very well received also by the private sector on how we can do more. Within the City of Melbourne, we've set up a new entity called Homes Melbourne with its own CEO and its own team to really drive how can we do more. We're looking at our own land and how we can deliver more affordable key worker housing, also more accessible housing. We've just done that at our Munro site at Queen Victoria Market Precinct with 56 new apartments that are affordable and accessible, and really driving more of that. We're looking at how we facilitate more in private sector projects, and that's still one of those tricky balancing acts. But we're really encouraged by build to rent becoming more prevalent in the City of Melbourne, and Melbourne more broadly as a key asset, a key infrastructure class that we haven't seen in Australia, that's well utilised in other countries like the US, Canada and the UK. And that'll bring more diversity, more flexibility to living in the city. And then, as I said, lastly, really making the most of accelerating where we can the big build from state and federal government to ensure that it happens as quickly as possible. Those are all a focus for Homes Melbourne and the City of Melbourne. And can I just mention, we've also got a project called Make Room, which is really about providing more space for rough sleepers and people experiencing homelessness, understanding that it's the full spectrum of housing that's required to make sure that we we can deliver a safe space to sleep every night for everybody that needs it. So for us, there is a housing shortage in Australia, Victoria and Melbourne, and we're very focused on that. And please know that quality of design and the way that we incorporate more social and key worker housing into our city is really central to what we're doing. Big projects like Green Line are essential for so many reasons, and it is happening, Felicia. It ticks so many boxes. It does create more green open spaces on the north bank of the Yarra. It does create economic stimulus that we saw happen with South Bank in the early 1990s, which is now a premier hospitality and entertainment precinct. Well, we are rejuvenating the north bank, but with parks, our ancient history, and new walking connections as the focus. And we know that it will drive economic stimulus now with more than 2,000 jobs, but $1 billion worth of economic value in the decades to come, because it will drive not just fantastic spaces for locals, but a lot of tourism interest, as Highline has done in New York, as we see with Little Island. I was there recently, Felicia, as a new bit of urban infrastructure also in New York. These projects also really say that even though many mayors around the world say, Sally, we would forgive Melburnians for drawing up into the fetal position and spending a bit of time in a dark corner somewhere after the experience you've had. Instead, we are being ambitious about what we can achieve in our city and what we want to deliver together. And that's really Green Line signals all of that as a 4-kilometre promenade from Birrarungma to the Balti Bridge that will literally transform our city, and something where work has already started, and it'll take us about 8 years to deliver it sort of that scale, but it has many benefits for our city and our community. Maybe some retail as well, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sally, just want to pick up on one of the things you mentioned, which is about design quality. At Infrastructure Victoria, we've done consultation with a broad range of community members about the circumstances under which increased density of the areas in which they live would be acceptable to them, and what good density looks like. And one of the key things they've told us is, good urban design, light, open space, good amenity. Tell us a bit about what the City of Melbourne's doing, around driving quality urban design.
Oh, well, so many things, Jonathan. In fact, our new policy on sunlight to parks just won an international award around urban design, really protecting sunshine in our green open spaces around the city. Of course, the state government has many measures in place to really protect setbacks, sunlight into buildings, and to monitor height. I know we have many examples in our city of buildings where people really shake their heads and they're disappointed, and I think every city has examples of those. But looking forward, we now have 2 design review panels for different parts. One is strategic planning, one is statutory. We have a big focus on sustainability, both in quality of build and how it contributes to our longer term, well, actually they're near and almost short term ambitions of being a 100% renewable energy municipality by 2030 and zero net carbon emissions by 2040. And we have our good design guidelines and green factor tools that people can use. We're also really focused, I think placemaking is such an important part of density. You can have density provided you've got that mixed use that creates a sense of community. And we've seen really that evolution of Docklands and all the things that we shouldn't do, and retrofitting that area is a big focus of ours to introduce that, I call it hyper mixed use, so that a sense of community is created literally on the streets and in the green open and open public spaces when people are living in towers above. So that's just to name a few, but all of those elements really coming together is critical for the long-term success of our city across attracting people, living well, and then sustainability. Those are all really important considerations.
Great, thanks, Sally. So, of course, this is a webinar titled Reimagining the City, How Can Melbourne Get Its Buzz Back? And so it would probably be good, before we close in our last minutes, to be able to touch in on your visions for the future of Melbourne for each of the panellists, and in particular, what might be your infrastructure wish list, be it hard or soft or policy change. When we talk about infrastructure, what do you think is the top priorities for the infrastructure we need to underpin a vision for a really thriving Melbourne in the future? And I might start with you, Paul, and you've got a great perspective, having working across Australia and having lived in multiple cities here. What's your vision and your wish list for Melbourne?
Look, my wish list is that there is a reset, and I think COVID has done that, and I think it's time to rethink the CBD with a blank sheet of paper, and that is all about thinking about it as a 24-hour economy. The CBD has to have a point of difference. It can't be just the beautiful architecture or the shopping, because people are valuing shopping locally. So from a retail point of view, we need to be able to move from day to night to leverage the CBD, so it becomes much more experiential and less transactional. So that's the whole thing. And the extension of family goes beyond just the kids. It becomes your pets as well. So I look to New York, and taking Felicia's point, for inspiration, because that is the best shopping city in the world. And that they've actually managed to rethink that. And my last point I was going to ask, you asked me about the trucks and deliveries. I mean, this whole later start for consumers and for workers in the city would mean that, getting product in and out and deliveries of goods before the city even opens becomes much more easy. So it's a reset. That's the summary.
Great, thanks, Paul. And how about you, Felicia? If you're looking at your sort of future vision for the city, and particularly one that's attracting both international and domestic tourists to both inner Melbourne and Melbourne more broadly, what's your vision and what's your wish list?
No, probably I've got two things I think that are top of my wish list, Jonathan. First of all, it comes down to this connectivity that we've been talking about before, and this sort of arrivals experience. So from the first time when people land in our city, I know the airport's doing an enormous amount of work to really reinvent its whole arrivals experience, and I'm sure we'll just go from strength to strength. But how do we make sure that we've got world-class connections into our city? And of course, Melbourne Airport Rail Link, we haven't talked about that, but that is such a crucial project from a visitor experience point of view. We talk about this global city status, but we don't have, a high-speed rail network that gets people from the airport to the city. My biggest concern, I have to say, is that this just becomes too much of a commuter system. We have to remember that the genesis of this whole project was about making a great experience for visitors to our city. But I'm very concerned that it becomes a quasi-solution for some challenges on commuter services as well. I just do not want to lose sight of the importance of making sure visitor connectivity from the airport into the city is the best that it can be, whatever form that takes. I just want to keep that front and center. And then also that connectivity in and around the city as well. The other piece I just want to touch on is this creation of visitor experiences. And, we have touched on the High Line, which is, I think, going to be a real high point, if you will, in terms of a new experience in our city. But we need some new attractions and new experiences that I really think we need more privately owned experiences. Interestingly, when you look around our city, most of our the cultural institutions, many of the attractions are either government owned or quasi-government owned. And, we really need to think about how we attract private investors to develop more experiences in our city as well. We put a lot of effort into attracting investors to build things in regional Victoria. We kind of need that same focus on our capital city as well. So those are probably just two. I've got a whole wish list, Jonathan, but I think I'll just stop there, because if we could fix a couple of those things, I'd be a very happy chappy.
That's a pretty good start, Felicia. Absolutely. And last but not least, Sally, what's your vision for Melbourne, particularly the elements that might be underpinned by our infrastructure?
Good. Well, Jonathan, I'll just touch on something new to add in there, and that is Melbourne as a renewable energy superpower. This is the opportunity to really grow a new sector around green tech and green infrastructure. We're kicking it off with a project called Power Melbourne, which is an independent network of community scale batteries to really drive the generation and storage of renewable energy, and and smoothing that into the grid, but also to drive demand for renewable energy. And for us, building infrastructure that supports and helps us achieve our ambitions around our responding to climate change, but at the same time, that transition of power and really ensuring that we are the job centre and industry sector leader for what is a very exciting opportunity for the future. That's really another big focus for us, and it's an infrastructure and people and technology opportunity.
Yeah, so an exciting and a really important opportunity. And what I'd note about what you said, but also many of the opportunities that Paul and Felicia have identified, is that they're very consistent with the content of Infrastructure Victoria's 30-year infrastructure strategy, which has a vision for the state beyond just Melbourne, but there's many synergies and consistencies with the recommendations we've got to the Victorian Parliament there for our long-term vision and planning. And of course, also much of what the panel have identified today is very consistent with the advice and research we've given government about navigating the transition through COVID to have a much more prosperous Melbourne. I'd like to thank all of our panel members for joining us today. I think it's been a great conversation and really good to get multiple perspectives from, of course, Sally's perspective as Lord Mayor, Felicia's as heading the Tourism Council in Victoria, and Paul's Retail Association views, which of course have a Melbourne view, but that national view as well, which has been really very useful. And of course, I'd also like to thank our audience members, particularly for the great questions that you've added to this discussion as well today. This is a webinar that is being recorded, and so be available for you and your colleagues to see afterwards. And if you're after any more information regarding some of the content we've talked about, you can find that on the Infrastructure Victoria website, and we'll be having further webinars in future. The next one is actually going to be about how we're going with our recycling and resource recovery efforts in Victoria. That's obviously something that there's been a lot of work done on in recent years. And we're going to touch in with some of the industry leaders about the progress we're making in Victoria in a more circular economy. So look forward to you joining us for that one, and stay tuned for advice around the date and link details for that. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a great day, and look forward to seeing you all either in virtually or in person. Have a great day. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.